As mentioned previously, my name is Paul Norris. I'm director of an engineering practice called Civic Engineers. I've been lucky to be involved in the design and implementation of a number of schemes that have been developed along the lines of the Healthy Streets approach to kind of improve places as well as focusing on movement. This is an analogy we always start off with when we're talking about our approach to street design. It's essentially a culverted watercourse, and this is the representation of the traditional design, the traditional approach to designing highways and roads. It's very functional, moves water, in this case, from A to B. Very straightforward to design and analyse, or maybe underselling it there. Relatively straightforward to design and analyse, but doesn't really add back any value to the places that it passes through. Just a functional piece of infrastructure. Whereas this is where we want to be. Again, in terms of the analogy, so you imagine this is a much more inclusive street design now. Still performs exactly the same function as the culverted watercourse, if not better. Yes, it's more challenging to design, but it requires more input from a lot wider spectrum of professionals, but also the community as well. A lot more thought and interpretation and adaptation. And in terms of analysis, you might not be able to model it exactly. You might not be able to predict behaviour exactly, but that's okay. And all the added value that this approach takes, the analogy gets a little bit tenuous here, but adds the amenity benefit, ecological benefit, opportunities for play and spending time in the stream or in the street, and the climate mitigation. In this instance, the river or the stream channel could accommodate much more in terms of floodwaters than the culverted watercourse could. So it's contributing positively to flood risk mitigation and climate change. Just a little kind of summary of actually how do we get to this approach? How do we apply our thinking to street design? I've gone right back to Manual for Streets, which was published in 2008. I still refer to it in these presentations. It's kind of year on year, making me realise how old I'm getting. But this document, we'd implemented this approach to street design for probably 10 years before this document was published, and we were constantly faced with highway authorities or other stakeholders saying, okay, we kind of understand what you're saying, but it doesn't apply, it doesn't meet with the relevant guidance. How can you justify taking this approach? We can't model it. Why are you promoting things like this? And what Manual for Streets did was kind of provide us with that document to refer to give us some robust justification to the approach that we were taking. So I'll very briefly run through some of the key themes. It established or reinforced the user hierarchy. So we're all pedestrians at one point or another. We're the most valuable users in terms of interacting with each other, and we're the most vulnerable users in a street environment. So we have to place pedestrians at the top of the user hierarchy when we're designing streets, and then working through cyclists, public transport users, through to other motor traffic. Very simple illustration here. It's not about a war on the motor car, just prioritising different modes differently when we're developing designs for streets, and looking at how we can better allocate space within the streets, potentially not to motor cars, to other modes of transport, but to other uses as well, to get more value from those streetscapes. A little GIF we like to include just because it's cool. It shows how much space you can actually save if you take those private vehicles off the road. Another thing that Manual for Streets reinforced was the importance of place when you're designing streets. So I think this graph essentially sets the movement status on the y-axis and the place status on the x-axis. I think we'd all agree, or there'd be very little disagreement, in the fact that the motorway is primarily there to move motor vehicles quickly and efficiently from one place to another. But actually, when you get into residential streets, high streets, it's not, or it shouldn't be necessarily about movement. It's about creating places for people to spend time, spend money, engage and interact with each other. Some of the key terms that were introduced through Manual for Streets: transformational change. It introduced the importance of culture in designing streets. Collaboration is key. Historically, the design of streets has very much been the domain of the highway engineer, but really, if we're at the point now where we're working with these kind of healthy streets principles, where you need much more input from a wider range of professionals and the community, landscape architects, urban designers, architects, ecologists, the list goes on. And we want to create high quality places. The streets make up the greatest part of the public realm. We can't hand over such a huge chunk of our outdoor space to the movement of vehicles. Really important statement for me. There was actually already formed part of the streets design guidance, but was replicated in Manual for Streets. And when planning new developments, achieving a good place should come from designing streets. A good place should come from before designing street alignments, cross sections, and other details. Streets should be fitted around significant buildings, important views, topography, sunlight, and microclimate. Historically, you're kind of, as an engineer as well, we draw up a section through a street. This is the width of the carriageway, this is the height of the curbs, this is your footway. Off you go, fit that into your landscape. It needs to be a much more sophisticated approach where we design a landscape first and then look at how we can weave the movement function into that. And of course, what happens when you start to take this healthy streets approach is you create this virtuous circle. You create attractive streets. More people want to spend time outdoors, whether that's just being in the places, whether it's walking or cycling. It feels safer, strengthens the sense of community, and you get a reduction in crime. You get people taking care of the streets, so they remain attractive, and it creates this virtuous circle. We end up with a much more attractive, valuable place. And then, of course, you layer into that all the benefits associated with green infrastructure. Touched on already. We've got the very kind of environmental benefits in terms of cooling and shading, contributions to air quality, interception of rainfall, and then the social benefits. They're actually just creating a much more attractive place can encourage people to spend time outdoors, can improve health and well-being. You get people walking and cycling. It's a much more attractive environment to spend time in. And healthy streets, I won't dwell on for too long, but essentially that's brought together all the thinking and the logic and the evolution of the design approach from Manual for Streets through to the present day, and is a really valuable tool. It's a TfL document, but we actually look at it and use it to apply the principles to streetscapes all around the country. I'm not sure if we're supposed to do that, but so. And just a very brief summary through some of the schemes that we've worked on now and implemented some of the kind of logic that we're talking about. This is New Road in Brighton. It's one of the schemes, the first schemes that I was involved in of this type. Previously, it's a very traditional streetscape. It's not really contributing anything at all to the fantastic heritage structures and exhibition gardens on the left. Everything is kind of marked out territorially. You've got the car park bays there that are marked out for loading, for disabled, for doctors. So there's parking bays there, but the general public aren't allowed to park in them. So you got people then parking in the contraflow cycle lane on the right-hand side of the screen. So the cyclists having to cycle down the middle of the street. Nothing's really working, and it's not adding a huge amount of value to the place. What we actually did in this scenario, and some of you probably know New Road well, through a number of iterations of trying to work out how we can get the street to work to its most efficient, most valuable, we actually thought, let's strip back all that regulation, let's take away all the control and just create a single level surface. You can still drive down here. Obviously, you do it very slowly and courteously, but the impact this has had now is that the street itself is actually, these statistics are a little bit old, so it could be superseded, but the third most popular tourist attraction in Brighton is the street. So people actually go to see the street, to spend time in the street. It's generated 175% more pedestrian traffic and 600% more stay-in activity. So the investment that Brighton made in that street has been repaid over and over in terms of what it's given back to New Road and to the fronting buildings and to Brighton itself. A little bit closer to home, or to where we are now, Leonard Circus in Hackney. Previously a very traditional highway scheme, very functional, evolved from the engineer telling you why the carriageway needed to be, what the radius on the curves need to be, and then an attempt to fill in the rest of the space with some paving and some art. And what they've implemented here is it's a truly groundbreaking scheme. This probably isn't the best picture of it, because actually the value is in the activity that the scheme has generated. If you haven't seen it already, get down there. There's what was previously just essentially a highway junction is now incredibly busy during the day. You've got street markets, food stalls there, really well used space. The weather, I guess, helps as well. But a key point about this image is that it could have worked really well if it was just a blanket of granite. But actually, the introduction of the trees is what's made the difference. That's where the value has really been added. And I don't know exactly the breakdown of costs, but I imagine the cost of the trees compared to the cost of the paving is relatively small, but the value is certainly on a par, if not higher. Canal Park. This was a street that was purely functional during the Olympics. A service road essentially. And what we did there, as part of a team, was just completely transform the space. This is the same street. The hard paved section there is the carriageway that you saw on the previous picture. We essentially just resurfaced it with some bonded gravel, punctured holes in the existing surface to introduce the tree planting, introduce the lawns to either side, and very cost effectively completely transform the space. And that shows there's the environmental and health and well-being benefits of green infrastructure, but just in terms of placemaking and adding value and transforming a place, it just contributes so much as soon as you introduce tree planting and green and blue infrastructure. There's another image there just showing how well they use the spaces, and it still performs the same function as it did previously. So you can still drive down there. Again, it's occasional traffic, very considerate traffic, but it performs all the functions but adds so much more value. We go back to the watercourse analogy at the start of the presentation. This is a scheme in Sheffield, kind of cavernous highway essentially, used solely for moving vehicles into and out of the city centre. If you note the yellow building on the edge of the screen there, just for context, this is what they've introduced there. You'll note the plants haven't taken yet on this image, but what they've done is it's a really exemplar piece of work. They've introduced this street swale essentially. There was lots of issues with flooding in Sheffield, so there's a big scheme of retrofit suds being rolled out across the city, and this was the first big kind of gesture in terms of the green infrastructure. So they've taken 1.5 lanes away from the carriageway. It still functions perfectly fine. It's not had any detriment in terms of the traffic movements. Given that over to this fantastic swale, slightly off topic, but really great detail along the edge of the swale here, where you quite often see people insisting on curbs along the edge of these features out of fear that people are going to drive into them. But they've bitten the bullet in Sheffield, provided this channel to really tidy detail that allows the carriageway water to run off into the swale, and then it makes its way down the hill. And this is a picture taken slightly further down the street, but this is obviously when the planting's taken. This is when the scheme's kind of in its full glory. So it's managing surface water, it's creating all the benefits in terms of green infrastructure, and it's actually, people are visiting this street now to spend time in the street. It's added value to the adjacent properties, and it's all really due to the introduction of this greater green scheme. So they could have taken the decision to pave the street in granite or some other measures that wouldn't have added as much value, would have cost a lot more, and it wouldn't have resulted in this kind of beautiful landscape that they've got now in Sheffield. Slightly more significant piece of infrastructure. This scheme's in Poynton in Cheshire. This is the before shot. You can see what tends to happen traditionally with highway design is that the carriageway expands to take up as much available space as possible through adding more and more safety factors, more and more capacity into the models. And it got to the point where the town was essentially being strangled by the highways infrastructure. There was very little opportunity to spill out onto the footways, very little opportunity to spend time, or why would you want to spend time in the streets when it's dominated so much by this infrastructure? The local authority and the council realised this was an issue, and the scheme that we implemented after a whole raft of different options, consultations, reviews, modelling, although the traffic modelling actually showed that it wouldn't work, and it took a brave councillor to stand behind it and say, let's go with it, let's see what happens. It works perfectly now in terms of traffic management and movements. So we stripped out the traffic signals, repaved, introduced trees, and it's had a massive benefit across the board. The congestion is reduced, the amount of space that's allocated to the carriageway is reduced, the number of voids in terms of the properties that weren't occupied is significantly reduced. Rates have increased. There's much more people now spending time in the streets, walking and cycling. And what we managed to do on this scheme was start to actually try and put a value to some of these additional benefits. So we used the whole raft of different measures and matrices, some of them from TfL, some of them from other research authorities, and managed to monetize the benefits in terms of reduced safety, improved safety, and reduced accidents. So less people having to visit hospital, less strain on NHS resources, less benefits having to pay out to people that have suffered accidents. And that came to a total of £315,000 annually in terms of a saving or a benefit. The congestion reduced. So we took out the traffic signals. The modelling said it would never work. It does work, and it's actually less congestion now. Everyone's moving through it at a much slower speed, but it's continuous movement. And improved health and well-being. There's much more walking and cycling, people out in the streets, and the benefit of that in terms of the impact on the NHS has been monetised, as shown there. Shortly after that scheme was delivered, we got the opportunity to look at implementing a similar scheme on a town-wide scale. So this is Altrincham, again was actually in Trafford, in South Manchester. And the town was similarly to Poynton, but for different reasons. It was suffering. It was really struggling to succeed. It had been hit by the recession. It's very near to the Trafford Centre, which is a big shopping centre in the north of England. And while it was quite an affluent community, everyone was travelling out of the town centre to visit amenities, attractions, and to do their shopping, essentially. So the town was really suffering. And we were brought in as part of a team by the local authority to develop a strategy that was landscape and streets focused for regenerating the town centre. So this is some of the kind of streets that we were faced with when we started work on the project. Going back to that watercourse analogy, they've been designed very much around the expeditious movement of vehicles, as it's referred to in the Highways Act. And you get so you're designing these spaces to allow vehicles to travel through more quickly, so then you're creating a hazard. You're having to introduce these guardrails, and very quickly you get into this circle of the whole street being dominated by the highway and highway paraphernalia. The similar streets, this is the main high street through the centre of Altrincham before we implemented the scheme. And it's one of those, for us, it's been a fantastic project because we've been involved from concept through to actually delivering some of the streets. This is a photograph of that high street now that the works have been implemented. The vehicle at the bottom really isn't moving that quickly. It's just an illusion. But it's again had a massive impact on the town centre. Repaving, reducing the amount of space that's allocated to carriageways, providing more crossing for pedestrians. Again, comes back to the healthy streets philosophy about enabling people to move across and along the street. There's another image of the same street there, and again. And then some of the other streets within the town centre. So before, similar to the Brighton New Road example, very traditional highway. This is the town centre of Altrincham, and it's the landscape, the streets are contributing very little, if nothing, to the viability and the success of the businesses in the town centre. And this was the scheme after we implemented it. Again, carpet of granite, quite costly, but will repay over time. But to me personally, the value is really all added through the green infrastructure and the trees. When these schemes have been implemented, and before the trees went in, you could walk the streets. It was only a few weeks, but as a design team, we were kind of like, we've done the right thing here. But as soon as you introduce the trees, completely changes the nature and the feel within the street. And we knew at that point that it was a really great scheme. Another image of a tree. And it's not just about streets, it's introducing specific functions. So on this scheme, there's an outdoor market in Altrincham. Previously it was locked away behind this wall and occasionally opened up and you had to kind of squeeze in through the gate and go and buy your fruit and veg. But we took away that wall, opened the whole street up, and it's a really, the vitality in that place now it's exceptional. And again, this is about treating the streets and the ground plane and the open space as something that is fundamentally there to add value to our lives and to towns and cities. Goose Green, this is a small square within Altrincham, which, whilst it was a square originally, it had again been kind of consumed by the highway and the vehicles. You got the monument in the middle that had kind of been circled in double yellow lines, very dominated by streets, the vehicles, and we got lined with bollards, and we stripped all that out again. And similarly, it's the trees that make the massive difference in this landscape. And just suddenly there's a little bit of skepticism, and you kind of throughout any of these projects, the retailers and the vendors and the people that occupy the premises adjacent to the works, you get constant complaints and disgruntled throughout the implementation process because it's disruptive to their livelihoods. But as soon as they could see what we were delivering, everyone suddenly started engaging with the place, seeing if they could get table licenses. Everyone's spilled out into this space now. You can still drive through there, but it just adds so much more value to Altrincham. And we've kind of developed, in Poynton, we use some matrices to try and provide monetary value to the benefits. We've worked with the social value consultancy to develop a more sophisticated matrix that now allows us to look in more detail at the benefits in terms of reduction in crime. We've got the savings to the police force. There's direct social benefit to a reduction in crime, and we've got £100,000 annual saving from the street works there. So it helps us justify these works to other local authorities that are asking, why do we want to do this? Increase in footfall by 10% speaks for itself. There's lots more people engaging with the streets, with the premises. A reduction in vacancy rates. So previously there were a lot of empty shops and spaces. The town was really suffering. All those shops have now started to, the quality of the offer has risen significantly, and the vast majority are now occupied. And that's brought with it an increase in employment. There's 90 new jobs, 24 new businesses, and a theoretical value there of £2.5 million that can be implied through the creation of those new jobs. So there's all the environmental benefits, all the health benefits, but being able to monetize those makes it much easier to justify the schemes and also to draw down on funding from other areas, because the impact of the streets isn't just about capacity and safety anymore. It's much wider. We're having huge benefits across the whole kind of social, economic, environmental, health and well-being, the whole spectrum. And then just to finish, really, this is a street in Manchester. It's called Great Ancoats Street. It's part of the Inner Ring Road. And as a practice, we kind of thought, this isn't the best use of this street. It's cutting off a section of the town. You've got city centre Manchester to the right, and then over to the left, I think the rental values were 20% lower. So we took it on ourselves. We thought, we're engineers, we've got the skills, we know people that we work with. Let's stop moaning about it. Let's just draw a scheme. Let's draw what it might be. It's not a project, but let's draw something. And so we drew this scheme completely speculatively, very much focused around green infrastructure, walking and cycling, getting people out of the cars, changing that barrier into a seam and allowing the city centre to breathe really and extend over to Ancoats, which is in this area. This has now garnered traction with the local authority. It probably will never be implemented exactly like this, but what I'd like to say really is, let's all of us just not talk about the problems and complain about the issues. Let's just draw. You don't need to be have a specific skill set. It's our knowledge as people as to how we use the streets that inform these designs. So let's get our pens out and draw some solutions.